It is December 1975. A 25-year-old electrical engineer named Steven Sasson is alone in a Kodak laboratory in Rochester, New York, late at night. In front of him, on a workbench, is a strange machine. It is roughly the size of a toaster. It weighs about 8 pounds. It runs on 16 AA batteries, and it has, soldered onto it, a digital cassette recorder of the kind people once used to play music. He has spent the better part of a year building this thing. And tonight, he is going to point its lens at his assistant across the room, press its trigger, and wait 23 full seconds while it captures, processes, and stores the image. Then, he is going to walk the cassette over to a custom playback unit, a separate machine he also had to build, plug it in, and watch the photograph he just took appear on a television screen. The image is 100 pixels by 100 pixels. It is black and white, and gray. It is, in human history, the first digital photograph ever taken on a portable camera. He carries his toaster down the hall the next year, and he shows it to his bosses. He is, by his own account in interviews he has given for decades now, calm. He is not selling. He simply demonstrates. He takes the executive's picture. He plays it back. They watch a small gray image of themselves appear on a screen, and they do not ask him how it works. They ask him why anyone would ever want to look at their pictures on a television. They tell him, in words he has remembered for 50 years and repeated to every journalist who has ever asked, that what he has built is, in his exact recounting of their reaction, cute, but don't tell anyone about it. They patent it. They file it away, and then they go back to selling little yellow boxes of film. 37 years later, the company files for bankruptcy. I'm Mort. I do autopsies on dead empires, and in my entire career, I have never seen a body and a murder weapon arrive on this table together. Until today. Both are right here. They're the same company. Let's open it up. To understand the size of this death, you have to understand the size of the empire. Because for over 100 years, this was not just a company, this was a thing that touched almost every family on the planet. The company was founded in 1880 in Rochester, New York, by a man named George Eastman, a former bank clerk who had decided that photography was too complicated for ordinary people, and that the way to make money was to fix that. At the time, taking a photograph required wet glass plates, a darkroom, and the patience of a saint. Eastman believed photography should be as simple as turning a key in a lock. He invented dry plates first, then flexible roll film, and then, in 1900, a $1 camera called the Brownie. The Brownie was the iPhone of its century. It put a working camera in every American family's hand, and it came with the most powerful business model anyone had ever invented in consumer products. The slogan, written on the box, was Eastman's own. You press the button, we do the rest. What that sentence meant, in business terms, was this. You bought the camera once, you then bought the film every single time you wanted to take a picture. From Kodak, you sent the film back to Kodak to be developed. You paid Kodak again to print the photographs. Then you bought more film. Then you sent that back too. Kodak didn't sell cameras, really. Kodak sold a subscription to memory itself. Every birthday, every wedding, every Christmas morning, every family vacation, every Polaroid-style snapshot of the family dog. Every yellow box was a small, recurring payment from a customer who would not even think of it as a payment, because the act of paying it felt like the act of preserving love. And the yellow boxes were everywhere. By the middle of the 20th century, Kodak controlled roughly 90% of the photographic film market in the United States, and the great majority of the camera market with it. Their products were on every drugstore shelf, in every supermarket, in every airport gift shop, in every dime store, in every photo lab in every small town, from Maine to California. The phrase, a Kodak moment, entered the English language as a generic noun for a precious thing worth preserving. Kodak owned a verb. Kodak owned an adjective. Kodak owned the yellow. At its peak, in the late 1980s, Eastman Kodak Company employed approximately 145,000 people worldwide. In its hometown of Rochester, New York, more than 60,000 of those people worked at Kodak, more than the University of Rochester, the city's largest hospital network, and its largest supermarket chain combined. Today, Kodak built schools, sponsored research, funded the city's museums, paid for the streetlights in entire neighborhoods. Rochester was a Kodak town the way Detroit was once a Ford town. Walk through the city in 1988, and you were walking through a company that owned, more or less, the global infrastructure of human memory. And in a windowless laboratory in one of its buildings, the device that would eventually disassemble all of it was sitting on a shelf, in a box, with its patent paperwork on file. The future had been quietly archived. My assistant has put both objects on the table. The patient, Eastman Kodak, age 132 at time of death, and the murder weapon, the very camera built in the company's own laboratory, by the company's own engineer, on the company's own money. In every autopsy I do, the hardest part is usually finding the weapon. Today, somebody left it next to the body. They didn't try to hide it. They didn't try to destroy it. They patented it. They protected it, legally, for the next 22 years. They simply chose not to fire it. They put it in a drawer and walked back to the office, where they sold yellow boxes. So my next question, on this table, is not where the weapon came from. We know exactly where it came from. My next question is, why did the room with the weapon in it decide not to use it? And the answer is, in some ways, the most human cause of death on this entire shelf. To be fair to the people in that 1976 boardroom, because we are going to be very hard on them in a moment, let's walk in their shoes for one paragraph. They were running, at that point, the most profitable photographic company in the world. Their film business had margins in some product lines above 80%. That is the kind of margin that is normally only found in software, or perfume, or actual medicine. Their entire business was a delicate, intricate, beautifully tuned machine that ran on one assumption, that the only way to keep a memory was to expose a tiny crystal on a film strip to light, develop it with chemicals, and print it on paper. Every link in that chain made them money. And now, into the boardroom walked a calm young engineer with a toaster and told them politely that he had built a device that would, in 20 or 30 years, make every link in their chain obsolete. He could not say when. He could not say at what cost. He could not say at what quality. He could only say that the future was, mechanically, on his bench. That the film business they had spent 96 years building was, on a long enough timeline, finished. What were they supposed to do with that information? They did the thing that has killed every dying empire I have ever put on this table. They did the most reasonable, most defensible, most rational thing they could have done, which was, in the end, the most fatal. They filed the patent, which protected the technology from competitors using it. They allowed Sasson to keep working on it, quietly, in the lab, but they did not put marketing dollars or factory floor space behind making it real. They told him, in his words to the New York Times, that the device was, quote, cute, but don't tell anyone about it. The internal reasoning, by every account from people who were in those rooms, was the same. Why would we, the leaders of the film company, kill the film business? If digital photography becomes a thing, we will be ready, because we own the patent. But film is the present, and the present pays the salaries, and the future is far away. We will get there when it gets here. And here is the part that should haunt every executive who watches this autopsy. Sasson kept working. In 1989, 14 years after the toaster, He and a colleague named Robert Hills built the prototype of the first true digital SLR, a digital camera that looked like a real camera, used a memory card, compressed images, and would have been entirely commercially recognizable. They brought it to the marketing department. According to Sasson, the marketing department's response was that yes, they could sell this device, but they would not, because if they sold it, it would cannibalize the film business. The film business that, at the time, was still putting hundreds of millions of dollars a year into the company's pocket. And so a second time, in 1989, the company chose itself. The company chose now over later. The company refused to eat its own most profitable child for breakfast, even though by then it was already clear someone else was going to. The decision was not made by villains. It was made by people doing their jobs, protecting the part of the business that fed their families, in the only way they had been trained to think. And every one of those decisions, on a long enough timeline, walked the company straight into this morgue. For roughly the next 2 decades, Kodak's strategy on digital photography would consist of trying to do enough of it to not look ridiculous, while not doing so much of it that the film business would suffer. That is approximately the worst possible strategy for a company sitting on a future-defining technology. They released digital cameras, but cautiously, at premium prices aimed at professionals rather than consumers, because consumer digital cameras would have killed film fastest. They kept selling film and film accessories and disposable cameras into the early 2000s, while every other camera company on Earth raced to scale up the very technology Kodak had pioneered. Sony built a digital empire. Canon and Nikon dominated the digital SLR market. Casio, Olympus, Fuji, all of them got there first, to a market Kodak had owned before anyone else even knew it was a market. And then, around 2007, the iPhone landed on every consumer's desk. A camera in a phone, with no film, no developing, no drugstore aisle, no yellow box. The Kodak moment came free with every cell phone bill. Kodak, who had invented the technology that built every one of those phone cameras, was watching the entire industry it had birthed grow up and replace it. The patent on Sasson's original 1975 device quietly expired in 2007. Kodak would file for bankruptcy roughly 5 years later. In 1997, a Harvard professor named Clayton Christensen wrote a book about a pattern he had been studying for years. He noticed that the companies most likely to be destroyed by a new technology were not the ones that had ignored it. They were the ones that had invented it. He called it the Innovator's Dilemma, and what it says, in plain English, is this: the thing that made you successful is the thing you must eventually destroy in order to stay successful. The very habits, the very margins, the very customers, the very factories that put you on top, those are the things that prevent you from leaving the top before someone else pushes you off it. The film business was the air Kodak breathed. The people who ran it would have had to suffocate the company on purpose, willingly, in order to save it. That is, it turns out almost impossible for a healthy organism to do. Kodak is the textbook case of this. The room with the weapon was not stupid. The room was, in a very specific and very tragic sense, alive. And living things, in my experience, do not voluntarily end themselves to make room for something better. They wait to be pushed. Watch what happens from here, because the speed is the point. This is not the 6-week WeWork collapse. This is not the 10-day FTX bank run. This is the slowest death on the entire shelf. Kodak began visibly declining in the 1990s, as competitors' digital cameras began cutting into camera sales, and as one-hour photo labs and disposable cameras began shrinking film margins. The company started cutting jobs. In 2003 alone, Kodak announced the closure of 13 manufacturing plants and 130 processing labs. Over the following decade, The workforce would shrink by approximately 47,000 people. Rochester, New York, the city that Kodak had been the lifeblood of for over 100 years, began emptying out. The streetlights kept working. The neighborhoods stayed standing, but the salaries that had paid for them began to disappear, one factory closure at a time. In 2005, Kodak named a new CEO, Antonio Perez, a smart, experienced executive who had previously run digital businesses at Hewlett-Packard. Perez understood that the film business was over, and that the only way to save the company was to find an entirely new thing for it to do. He pivoted the company's strategy toward commercial printers, large industrial machines for businesses, not consumer cameras. It was, on paper, a reasonable bet. In practice, it did not work fast enough. Kodak had not posted an annual profit since 2007, the year the iPhone was unveiled and the year Sasson's original digital camera patent expired. Coincidence has a sense of humor about timing. And here is the unexpectedly grim chapter of this story, because by the late 2000s, Kodak's actual operating businesses were not generating enough cash to pay the bills. So the company began doing what dying empires do when they have run out of products to sell. It began suing other companies for using technology it had patented. Kodak filed lawsuit after lawsuit against Apple, against Samsung, against BLACK Berry Maker, RIM, claiming infringement on the very digital imaging patents it had quietly filed in the late 70s and through the 80s. For a period of years, the company was, by some estimates, generating more revenue from intellectual property lawsuits than from selling actual things. The pioneer of photography had become, in the end, a holder of paperwork, collecting tolls on the future it had invented and refused to enter. The patents were the last asset standing. And then, even that ran out. The lawsuits succeeded enough times to keep the lights on for a while, but the company's debts kept growing, and its pension obligations, hundreds of millions of dollars owed to retirees who had worked at Kodak for entire careers, became impossible to sustain. By the end of 2011, the company's Rochester employment had collapsed from a peak of 60,000 plus to roughly 5,100. 1888. Kodak, 5,100. In Rochester. On January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak Company, founded in 1880 by George Eastman, the company that owned the verb, the noun, and the yellow, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in a federal court in New York. The filings listed approximately $5.1 million in stated assets against $6.75 billion in liabilities. The empire of yellow had run out of money. What happens after a 132-year-old company goes bankrupt is more ironic than dramatic. The lawyers come in, the assets are sorted, the pension is renegotiated. The pieces that still have value are put up for auction. And for Kodak, the most valuable thing left in the company's vaults was the one thing it had always had, the one thing that had quietly bankrolled it through the lawsuit years, its portfolio of digital imaging patents. The patents that Sasson and his colleagues had filed in the late 1970s and through the 80s, the very paperwork that, had Kodak acted on it, would have made the company the dominant force in the digital age. In December 2012, while still in bankruptcy, Kodak put approximately 1,100 of those patents up for sale. The initial estimates for what they might fetch ran as high as $2.6 billion. The final sale price, after months of negotiation, was approximately $525 million, roughly 1/5 of the original estimate. And here is the part of this autopsy that, if Steven Sasson had a sense of humor, he might find genuinely funny. The buyers were a consortium of 12 technology companies, organized by 2 intellectual property firms. Among the names on that list of buyers, Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Samsung, Amazon, The companies that ran the cameras in every phone, on every desktop, in every cloud in the world. The companies whose existence was made possible by digital photography. They walked into bankruptcy court, opened their wallets, and bought for pennies on the dollar the foundational patents of the technology Kodak had handed them by failing to use. The digital age, in its closing chapter on this story, came back to Kodak's deathbed and politely took the toaster camera, the patent vault, and the future Kodak had filed away in 1976 for about $500 million. Eastman Kodak Company emerged from Chapter 11 on September 3, 2013, 19 months after filing, as a smaller, focused commercial printing company with around 5,000 employees. It still exists. It still sells some film, mostly to filmmakers who want the nostalgic look. In 2022, it announced it was repurposing some of its old film manufacturing machinery to produce battery components for electric vehicles. The iconic machines that once made the medium of human memory, now turning out small power cells for cars. The yellow box, at last count, is on a museum shelf. There is one human coda to this autopsy I owe you, because it might be the only line of warm light in the whole file. Steven Sasson, the engineer in the basement, the man with the toaster, the patient, quiet hero of this entire story. He kept working at Kodak for 35 years. He kept making things. He kept filing patents on improvements to digital photography that the company would again and again choose not to fully commercialize. He was never bitter about it in any of the interviews he has given over the decades. He has consistently said in his quiet engineer's way that the executives in that 1976 boardroom were not foolish, that they were doing the only thing the structure of their company would let them do. And that he understands why. In 2009, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, awarded Steven Sasson the National Medal of Technology and Innovation, the highest honor an American technologist can receive, for the invention he had built 34 years earlier in that lab. Sasson stood on a stage and received the medal 3 years before the company that had paid for the bench he built it on would file for bankruptcy. He had been right, eventually. Being right, eventually, is the cruelest reward this autopsy ever has to record. So let me record the cause of death. For the file, Eastman Kodak Company did not die because the world stopped wanting photographs. The world takes more photographs today than at any other moment in human history. Billions of them every single day on the digital sensors that Kodak invented. The world is, in volume, more Kodak's vision than Kodak's vision ever was. Kodak died because, in 1975, in its own laboratory, with its own engineer, its own money, and its own time, the company invented its own future, and then chose, multiple times over decades, to put that future in a drawer in order to protect a profitable present. The empire was killed not by a competitor it failed to see. It was killed by a competitor it built and then refused to release. Cause of death, self-inflicted. Method, a patent, filed and held. Time of death, January 19th, 2012, in a federal courthouse in New York. But the wound that finally killed it was opened on a workbench on a December evening in 1975, when a young engineer demonstrated the murder weapon to its bosses, and they decided it was, in his own recounting of their words, cute, but don't tell anyone about it. This is the cleanest autopsy I have ever performed. There is no rival on the table. There is no fraud. There is no missing founder. There is no leveraged buyout. There is only a company and the cause of its death, and they are the same thing. That's another one for the shelf. The next time someone in your own company, a quiet engineer, a junior analyst, a designer, a kid in the marketing department, walks into the room with a toaster camera and asks you why anyone would ever want to look at their pictures on a television. Listen to the question for 1 extra minute before you answer. The future, in my experience, never quite gives you a second demonstration. If you want to watch the next autopsy, you know where the door is. I'll leave the light on.